Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave. If you've been watching the playlist about the pre-Socratic philosophers, you know that I've been hyping up the clash between Parmenides and Heraclitus by calling it the greatest debate of all time. This may have given the impression that everything else in Greek philosophy before Socrates and Plato is kind of boring and uninteresting, but nothing could be further from the truth. In this video and the next, we will begin by looking at the first two philosophers who philosophized immediately after the Great Clash, namely Empedocles and Anaxagoras. What we will see is that both will react to Parmenides' challenge and Heraclitus' observation. Both will try to explain how it can be that things be, as Parmenides stated. Yet there is change, as Heraclitus pointed out. But there is more. Empedocles, the subject of this video, also interacted with and tried to synthesize all the other philosophers who came before him. Thales and the Milesians, Xenophon, and especially Pythagoras, all influenced the philosophy of Empedocles. This makes him, according to some, actually the greatest of all the pre-Socratics. Before moving into his philosophy, let's first have a look at his life as far as we can reconstruct it. He was born somewhere in the early 5th century and died some 60 years later. The most common dates are 484 to 424 BC, which makes him an early contemporary of Socrates. He was born in Akragas, nowadays called Agrigentum, on Sicily. You may remember that Pythagoras ended up in Syracuse, also on Sicily, where he founded his school, or cult. On the island of Sicily, you will also find the volcano Etna. Empedocles came from a family that could boast about one of them, namely Empedocles' grandfather, also named Empedocles, who had won the horse race at the 71st Olympiad, a few years before his grandson's birth. On to Empedocles' life. He was a colorful figure. Literally, he is said to have worn a purple robe, which has a royal connotation, a golden girdle, and bronze slippers, so a lot of bling, and a Delphic laurel wreath, often being a sign of an athletic victory. And then there are stories of what he supposedly did, walking around from place to place, offering both prophecies and healing to all who were in need of either. The stories include him not just healing sickness, but even death. Oh, and according to some sources, he even claimed to be divine. Speaking of death, though there are many stories about his death as well, including at least two involving death by Etna, where he jumped into the volcano to prove he was a god. In one version, he jumped in alone and in secret, hoping that his sudden disappearance without a body would lead to speculations about him ascending without dying. But Etna spewed out one of his bronze slippers to prove he had jumped in and died. In another version, he jumps in with a crowd of his disciples, hoping that he would survive the fall and so prove his divinity. Both of these stories are almost certainly not correct, and most historians believe that he died somewhere in the Peloponnese. Now on to his philosophy. According to ancient historians, he wrote two books, or rather, like Parmenides, Heraclitus and Xenophon, book-length poems. In a way, it was exactly like Parmenides, since he copied not just his genre of philosophic poetry, but his style as well, namely a hexameter verse. The two titles of the books he wrote were On Nature and Purifications, and though those books themselves have long been lost, many citations have survived in the works of later scholars. It was believed that On Nature dealt with a naturalistic explanation of the universe, while his Purifications dealt with a mystical or spiritual belief or set of beliefs that he held. Let's start with his naturalistic explanation of the universe. If I were to ask you, what are the four elements, there is a good chance that you will answer fire, earth, air, and water. These four elements you can find in many video games, fantasy worlds, TV shows, and role-playing games. But where did the idea first come from? Many will point to Empedocles, who was wrestling with Parmenides and Heraclitus. How can it be that things exist yet change? How can it be that things come into being and are then destroyed? Parmenides had proven that this is impossible, Yet Heraclitus had shown that change is constant and inevitable. And this is where Empedocles introduced his four elements. But though he is often credited with inventing the idea, I think he may very well have been inspired by Heraclitus. Remember Heraclitus' fragment number 25. Fire lives the death of air, and air lives the death of fire. Water lives the death of earth, earth that of water. Thales had proposed that all was water, and Anaximenes thought of air instead, and Heraclitus had talked a lot about fire in a similar manner. That's it. Water and air and fire were all roots, and earth would complement them. The term elements would be used later, but Empedocles always uses the word roots. At one point he associates these four roots with four gods: Zeus, Hera, Aidoneus, and Nestis. Zeus with his lightning bolt was likely water, Hera air. Aidoneus is a king associated with Hades, and he would represent fire, and Nestis is another name for Hades' wife Persephone, referring to earth. But then, how do these four roots interact with each other? Remember Anaximenes. He had talked about condensation, that is the coming closer together of air particles, and rarefaction, when they spread out more. But what could cause things to come closer together and what could drive them apart? Well, what do you call it when two humans come close together? Love, of course. And what if they drift apart? Strife. And again, he may very well have been inspired by Heraclitus. See for example fragment 59. Couples are things whole and things not whole. What is drawn together and what is drawn asunder. The harmonious and the discordant. The one is made up of all things, and all issue from the one. I am emphasizing his possible inspiration by Heraclitus, since most philosophers I've read all heavily emphasize his inspiration by Parmenides. An inspiration not at all unjustified, to point out, I might add. For Empedocles also had to answer the following question: how did it all begin? Has the world always been like this? Namely, always having love bring some roots together over here and strife separating some other roots over there? No, says Empedocles, for in the very beginning, or in a very beginning, all roots were all together in perfect love and harmony, in one perfect sphere. Everything was perfectly mixed and balanced, with love holding it all together. This seems to most closely resemble a world as Parmenides imagines it is right now, with all change being mere illusions. Look at this quote, which brings a lot of these ideas together. Twice I shall tell, for then it grows to be one alone, instead of more. Then again, it disperses to be more instead of one. Twofold is the birth of mortals, and twofold their demise. For while the running together of all things begets and destroys one, yet another is first nurtured and then gone, as they again grow apart. And these taking turns forever never find remission. At one time coming together in love, all things into one. At another again, each carried apart in the hatred of strife. This quote goes on, but the main ideas are here. Traditionally, this passage has been understood as follows. Starting at the point I just described and highlighted here, that at one point everything was unified in love. Then it slowly begins to fall apart, and we get a universe because strife pushes things apart, while the varying roots are mixed and mingled by the forces of love and strife. That is when you get a world where mortals are born until the world is destroyed because of strife, because then strife has carried it apart in the hatred of strife. And so the first world is destroyed. Then the force of strife is dominant, and now love begins to slowly bring things together again, also forming a world with mortals. The second time of this twofold birth, until the second world is also destroyed because everything collapses in on itself due to the overabundance of love. And on and on and on the cycle goes. So where Thales and all those who followed him so far all agreed that there had to be one underlying arche underneath everything, Empedocles now talks about four roots and two forces. And because of that, he, like Anaxagoras as we'll see in the next video, seems to have given up on the idea of a single thing that explains everything. He is often called a pluralist instead of a monist, like Thales and all the others. But that's the whole cosmos. What about living creatures? The mortals he mentioned, how did they come to be? Here is another long quote from him. Where many heads grew up without necks, and arms were wandering about naked, bereft of shoulders, and eyes roaming about alone with no foreheads. This is indeed remarkable in the mass of human members. At one time, all the limbs which form the body, united into one by love, grow vigorously in the prime of life, but yet, at another time, separated by evil strife. They wander each in different directions, along the breakers of the sea of life. Just so it is with plants and with fishes dwelling in watery holes, and beasts whose lair is in the mountains, and birds borne on wings. But as divinity was mingled yet more with divinity, these things kept coming together in whatever way each might chance, and many others also in addition to these continually came into being. Many creatures arose with double faces and double breasts, offspring of oxen with human faces, and again sprang up children of men with oxen's heads. Creatures too, in which were mixed some parts from men and some from the nature of women, furnished with sterile members. An absolutely fascinating tale of how love and strife randomly combined individual body parts and, perhaps through some form of natural selection, only caused the combinations fit for survival to live on. This is sometimes called an evolutionary tale, and it is, in the sense that we have random generation of living creatures and natural selection, though at the same time it is also quite wrong. Now put a pin in this whole story as we look at some of his other writings, and let's dive right into it. As briefly mentioned before, he claimed to be a god, or more specifically, a daimon, which in Greek mythology meant a divine spiritual being. In the far distant past, he had committed a sin, which caused him to be cast out from the divine realm and forced to spend 30,000 seasons living as various plants, animals, and humans, until he reached some goal. That goal being either serving his time or reaching some stage of enlightenment. In fact, he may even have taught that everyone, all plants, animals, and humans, are these fallen daimons, on their way to reunification with their former state of perfection. And this belief may have inspired him to be a strict vegetarian, while also avoiding beans and bay leaves. If all of this sounds somewhat Pythagorean to you, you have been paying attention. And it is precisely because of these beliefs that he is assumed to have been a follower of Pythagoras, at least for a while. In any case, it was previously believed that all of his naturalistic or mechanistic teachings were in his book called On Nature, but his more spiritual beliefs about reincarnation and the like were in his book called Purifications. But in the late 1990s, surprise, surprise, the first ever partial manuscript of Empedocles was found in Strasbourg, and it contained parts of texts and quotations that dealt with both subjects, both the naturalistic and the spiritual. So, how are these two philosophies connected? I mean, both topics are discussed just a few lines apart. There must be some connection, right? Well, most scholars are still scratching their heads over that one, but one suggestion I've read, and here I have to give credit to Catherine Osborne in her A Very Short Introduction to Pre-Socratic Philosophy, she thinks that perhaps the original sin of which Empedocles was guilty was part of strife being introduced into the perfect sphere of love, setting in motion not just his personal exile of 30,000 years, but also the creation of the world. It is a fascinating suggestion, at least. Now, he did write a lot more about things like medicine, perception, as in like how we see and sense things, and about embryology. A lot of it, in fact, almost all of it, is hilariously wrong, but it does show that in all instances he really did try to come up with a coherent explanation for all sorts of things in the world, all based on the four roots and the two forces that directly or indirectly could explain all sorts of things. But here I will end our discussion of Empedocles. The next pre-Socratic philosopher who will try to synthesize Parmenides and Heraclitus is Anaxagoras. Like, subscribe, and follow me on social media to stay in the loop.